I'm Paul McManus. I'm a faculty member over the School of Management. It's my great honor and pleasure to be here to introduce this panel here today. I've got a couple of quick opening remarks, last about 2 minutes, and then I'll do my introductions, and then we'll move on with the program. I'll start just very briefly with a little bit of me and my background, because I think it presents an interesting perspective on things. I came as an alum, came back in 2006 to teach at the School of Management. I had the great opportunity to go off and introduce two brand new courses into the School of Management. In 2008, in September, I introduced a course on globalization a month before Lehman Brothers went bankrupt, which was an interesting point in time. Second, after that, I introduced a course on global sustainability, which I have one of my students here in the class, a month after the Copenhagen COP15 meeting, which was also an interesting pivot in terms of my strategy for the course. Changed quite a bit about what I wanted to do, but what I learned out of that is a couple of things. We do indeed live in interesting times, and I don't think there's any more interesting time in my lifetime than the current time that we're living in here. Secondly, really looking at the issues of these great, perhaps abstract global matters have real implications at the local level, and the contrast between the global issues and these global challenges and what has to get done on the ground in the local community, the local environment, is a startling contrast for me, and really brings forward a very interesting set of challenges that we have to go off and face. Thirdly, it's always important to have Plan B in hand. For those two courses, that was really essential for me, and proved to be very beneficial to have the ability to kind of change my strategy with those syllabi as things changed. About around the same time, as we're all probably very familiar with, 2008, the UN and other bodies projected that the world became urbanized at that point in time. 2011, we have a population that broached 7 billion people. I'm moving towards a projected 9 billion people by mid-century, presenting certainly significant challenges and stress on our systems and society overall, things that we're going to have to go off and deal with. And that's really the basis of our program here for this year with the urban century. I really have a perspective that we're in a period of renaissance. I'm an optimist. I've spent 5 years of my life recently being incredibly depressed, spending all of my time reading negative reports on things that are going bad and things that aren't working well and things that are broken, and oh my God, we're not going to be able to fix these problems. I've come out of that process much more optimistic about us and our condition and our potential to go off and affect change. When change is necessary, we as a species step up to that, and I think really respond to that. So I'm in fact optimistic as compared to where I was a couple of years ago, and hopefully the program will shed some light on that. I think as we move forward, it's important for us to be able to make right choices. Those are inherent in the ability for cities to go off and scale and provide benefit. Jeffrey is going to be coming in April to talk about the mathematics of urban settings and cities and how economies of scale will work to our benefit, hopefully in the long run, if we do make good choices. And I think that is a bit of a wind at our back in terms of a natural tendency and a trend in the world overall to kind of really help us from a physical and natural phenomenon basis. The social side, the economic side, actually trends along with that as well, and we'll see that as we move forward in the program. Important decisions need to be made. Tough choices need to be made, and as I teach strategy, trade-offs need to be made. And what we hope to do is make those as intelligently as in forward-thinking way as we possibly can. I want to affect change in the world. That's why I'm really here. I can't think of a better place to really be in a position to go off and do that than here at Boston University. And we're an elite research institution doing amazing things across our campus. We have the ability to work very collegially across our schools and our departments, looking at multidisciplinary approaches to things, able to go off and engage stakeholders from all parts of the community across campus, in civil society, with government, and engaging industry as well as we move these programs forward. I think it's a tremendous opportunity. I refer back to Lemuel Herbert Merlin. Anyone know who that is? You people? Our third president. envisioned Boston University back there when we were a Methodist institution back in the early days as an institution in the heart of the city in service to the city. And I think very much we play a role in the 21st century as an institution that's very much in the heart of Boston here, looking to serve our local community in this regard and the community at large around the world. I also can't think of a more interesting group of folks. I know two of the folks here reasonably well and worked very closely with Nathan on a number of things. I can't think of a better group of people to bring a broad perspective to this very complex issue than the panelists that we have here today. Very quickly, I will introduce them, and they will do a couple of minutes of opening remarks. What we will look to do is engage in what I hope to be vigorous and eager dialogue. I do teach the case method over at SMG, so I am very familiar with cold calling people out of the audience and putting them on the spot to engage them in discussion. So if you don't want that to happen to you, raise your hand or speak out. Our three panelists today here are from my extreme right to my immediate left here, Susan Eckstein, professor of the Department of Sociology at BU, expertise in the area of urbanization, immigration, poverty, rights, injustices, and social movements. Real particular focus on developing world, developing countries and economies, Latin America, a real area of specialty for Susan. Briefly, Nathan Phillips, center here, associate professor in the Department of Earth and Environment, that's the correct one now. Earth and Environment, a College of Arts and Sciences. Particular focus is environmental policy, but this thing called the urban metabolism is an area that we work on, in particular here with our programs here on campus. I'm sure he'll talk a little bit about that. Finally, Steven Strauss, currently at Harvard at the Advanced Leadership, he's a fellow at the Advanced Leadership Program, formerly managing director in New York City under the Bloomberg administration for the Economic Development Corporation, and previous to that, he was a director and advisor to the World Economic Forum on financial institutions. So as you can see, we bring together expertise from a very broad set of perspectives that hopefully will start to demonstrate not only the complexity of the issue, but how these issues are in fact interwoven and issues we address in one may in fact have leverage or response and result in others. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our panelists. I'm going to sit back, try and get out of the way, and Susan is going to lead off and take it away.
It's a pleasure to be here, and as was mentioned, my presentation is focusing on issues of urbanization in developing countries, and mainly I'm giving you an overview of urban trends, what are some of the forces or causes that have contributed to urbanization, and what effects do they have. So I'm actually dealing less probably than some of the other speakers with nitty-gritty pragmatic aspects, although I will weave in some issues about policy implications, and certainly afterwards we can go back and discuss some of the policy issues. First, I want to raise the issue about how should we view urbanization in developing countries. Is this good? Is it bad? And then we'll go into what are the causes and the effects. And the countries that developed first, developed as they urbanized. And so urbanization was associated with economic development, industrialization. And the question is, when we go across borders to the developing countries where about 80 to 85% of the world's population live, the question is, can we see a repetition of this kind of experience in developing countries, that urbanization is associated with economic development and other positive developments for societies? So, I should say that when we speak of urbanization, we tend to use the percentage of populations living in cities. Definitions can vary, but usually cities of places with over 100,000 people are considered urban. Some places use 20,000, and as I'll show you, there are many cities that are much larger than that in the developing world. And indeed, some of the largest cities no longer are in the rich countries, but rather in the developing world. So if there's anything positive urbanization, it should be, in fact, more so in the developing countries with the high rates. So the question is, is urbanization a positive phenomenon? And Is it a symptom of a problem? Or is it a source of new problems? So that's really the framework in which you should be thinking as I talk about the urban experience in the developing world. And LDCs, for those that you don't know, is a term used less developed countries. It's not necessarily my preferred term to use, but it only takes up 4 characters on a slide. So, and it's a very commonly used word. But I do sometimes use, for purposes of the slides that I do have, the term DCs, which is developed countries, i.e. the rich countries of the world. So then the question is, are they following the countries that develop first? And there are 2 things that I really want to address. First is, what are similarities and differences between the developed and less developed world? And secondly, what are differences among the developing countries? And so I will point to these kinds of issues as I move along now. So here we have some information on rates of urbanization by region. Now, obviously, in any of these regions, there are significant differences, but it is, I think, useful to get an overview. And one thing that you should realize from this is that not all developing countries are alike, or developing regions, that there are significant differences. And what you can see here is that the range of urbanization in the developing world goes from a low of sub-Saharan Africa, where it's 36% living in cities, and close behind, mind you, East Asia, with 39% living in cities as of 2005. There's always a time lag with data if you want to get overview data. And then the highest regions in the developing world is actually Latin America and the Caribbean. And you can see there that with 77% of the people living in cities, that the rate of urbanization is almost on par with the rich countries of the world. So even though in terms of the economies, they are far behind. So what you can see from this table is a huge variation, and that the variation is not explained by or correlated by levels of economic development. In other words, Latin America, much poorer than the rich countries, has the same rate of urbanization. The rate in East Asia is almost the same as in Africa, and of course East Asia is one of the most dynamic regions of the world. So in other words, other factors are contributing to urbanization than economic development. So what are some of the causes of urbanization? Generally, people speak of the so-called push and pull factors. What are the factors that are inducing people to leave the countryside? And then what are the pull factors what are inducing them to come into the cities? Historically, people moved within rural areas and they didn't move to cities. So it's not a priori that if you're going to move from the countryside that you're going to move to the cities. So the push factors, the main ones I think you could argue are economic factors. And ironically, the very development of the countryside is a key factor that's leading to urbanization. In other words, with the mechanization, the capital intensification of agricultural production, which leads to higher productivity, it's sort of machines replacing man in the production process, and so becomes more and more surplus labor. And even under the best of circumstances, except for the large landowners, the laborers earn very little. They're usually the worst wages in an economy, and poor people can't get access to land, so they're landless, etc. So these are some of the key factors that are contributing. We are living in a neoliberal era, and actually this is a further factor. It's not the initial factor, but it is certainly an important contemporary factor that is sparking yet higher rates of urbanization in the developing world. And one of the reasons in the context of push factors is that free trade is opening borders, and Iowa corn farmers, for example, their exports are undermining the capacity for peasants in countries such as Mexico to compete, and so they're getting wiped out of what has been their source of living since time immemorial. Okay, so macroeconomic, global economic policies are a further factor contributing to urbanization. demographic, yes, in certain places there's too many people on too little land, but if you look around the world, you have countries like Japan, Holland, that are very densely populated countries that are doing very fine. So it's a distributional issue that's more important than how demographically concentrated is the population. And in most countries, actually, there may be certain regions that are densely populated, but others that are sparsely populated. So it's not a key factor, I would argue. Pull factors, so what are the factors contributing people to come to the cities? And again, I would argue that you can have to look at sort of macroeconomic policies. Under import substitution, which was the prevailing policy in most developing countries from the 40s until the mid-80s, when countries were implementing policies to promote their own economic development and keep out the kind of foreign competition that I was just describing. And during that period, governments intervened to maintain low costs of living in the cities, to induce people to leave the countryside for the cities. So they tolerated squatter settlements, the poor people finding their own housing solutions. They controlled the basic price of the basic bread basket, which typically wasn't bread, but rice or potatoes or whatever. And so these were factors, and also just industry being located in the cities, that were luring people to come to the cities when conditions in the countryside were getting so bad. And then also education. This varies by country, by region, but in regions such as Latin America, which have such high rates of urbanization, there's a substantial concentration of education opportunities in the cities. So the unequal access to education is, with families wanting to improve the opportunities for their children, it's yet another factor, a pull, if you will, to move to the cities. So what are some of the consequences of urbanization? And here I will go over demographic, economic, and social. So in terms of demographic consequences, one of the key things you find are what are called primate cities. Now, these are not apes running around the city. I'm only reporting the terminology that's used. I don't love it. But basically what this is referring is to that it's not just movement to cities, but to very selective cities. And so the growth of secondary cities is minimal. And most of the concentration of migration from the countryside has been to the key cities in countries, and in many countries, only one or two cities in a country having, maybe at least a fifth of the population in just one location. So that's something very distinctive to the urban experience of poor countries. And also the term urbanization has been used to capture the fact that many more people are migrating than the economies of the cities are expanding and able to absorb them. So, it's to say it's too urban for its own good, if you will. And you also, and I will present some data in a second, have the development of so-called mega cities in the developing world. Economically, what you're finding is the urbanization of poverty. In other words, the urbanization is not the solution to the problems of rural poverty. And so there's been, in many respects, a transfer of poverty from the countryside to the cities, with many people not getting access to jobs that provide a secure living income or social security benefits, health care, pensions, etc. And the informal economy is the term that is used to reflect where most of the employment is now occurring in developing countries, with these insecurities that I just mentioned. And it's very competitive, so as the cities grow, it is driving down wages in this sector. Globalization is another factor that contributes to it. I don't know if any of you have read the book by Boo, Beyond the Beautiful Forevers, which is about an urban slum in Mumbai. I highly recommend it. She's a New Yorker writer, so she writes very well. And she even talks about global demand for scrap material is affecting these poor people and what they can earn for their recycling and things like that, which is their main source of livelihood in this slum that she describes. So there's really a linkage, it's often indirect and not understood, between global economic dynamics, downturns in the world economy, and what is the opportunities and earning possibilities of people in the poorest people in developing countries. So in terms of social consequences, one of the most severe consequences today, meaning around the turn of the century, has been the increase of crime, from petty crime to the increasing presence of gangs that are taking over cities and making life very insecure for people. It's when their surveys are done of what are your key concerns, invariably these days crime is listed as number one, even more than economic kinds of issues. So it really has become a serious problem. Some of it in some countries is actually tied to the deportation of undocumented workers in the United States. This has been particularly true in El Salvador, where in the Los Angeles area, when there have been deportations, which have really increased under the Obama administration, the deportees bring the U.S. gangs with which they affiliated in Los Angeles back to El Salvador, and they are just reaping havoc over El Salvador. And then these gangs are spanning out from El Salvador to other countries, so that the networks and tentacles of these gangs are really spreading throughout Central America and even South America now. Transportation has been chaotic in the sense that because poor people are living often on the outskirts of cities, because that's where they can find a place to live and a place that they can afford, often hours from where they have jobs. Transportation in many cities, particularly these large cities, has gotten out of control, and you can't predict when you're going to get to work or anything like that. Here is one of the main upbeat things I think I can report. That actually the model comes from Curitiba in Brazil, where the mayor tried to do something about the chaos of the cities, and has introduced a new transportation system which is based on buses, so it's low cost compared to subways. And whole lanes are being dedicated to the buses, and they try to figure out what makes subways work so well. One of the things is when the subway comes, you just zoom in, people go in and out, and that's it, and then the subway goes off. And so they've set up these ways in which you can pay already before the bus comes, so that's speeding up the process. This actually always makes me think of BU this year, because there are many fewer parking spaces at BU this year. I think somebody told me 150 less parking spaces, and every time I'm worried, am I going to get a parking space or even get a place in the parking garage, because now there's more demand for the parking garage than before. I think, oh my gosh, I shouldn't get too angry. If I were, this is good. This is Curitiba at work here, cutting down use of cars, et cetera. So, I mean, it's really been interesting. What they've done is they've made it more difficult for you to drive. So to increase your incentive to use the bus system, they've cut out parking spaces in the city and have fewer lanes in which to use it. So this model has really been picked up by other countries. I had a student who talked to me in Lagos. In Nigeria, they've implemented it in several other Latin American cities as well. So it's really been an inspirational model because these mega cities are just really out of control these days. So I think for reasons of space, I'm not going to talk too much about the informal economy, but the point is that a huge percentage of the population of cities in some of these BRICS, in the most dynamic economic cities, much less in the non-dynamic ones, are growing with this informal economy, with all the insecurities that it offers. Here's just to give you a sense of some of these mega cities that are developing and how it's really a phenomenon of the last half century. I mean, there was a time when New York City was the largest city in the world, or even Tokyo. And now these cities in the rich countries are being superseded demographically in size by these cities in the developing world. So I've just put some data on a few of them for you to see, how large these cities are, how fast that they have grown, and so that the kinds of problems that are coming with this kind of speed at which the cities are expanding faster than infrastructure is expanding, faster than the economy is able to absorb the people in decent jobs. And here is another sense, to convey to you is how some of the cities are just really poor people being, and so it's hard to argue under such circumstances that urbanization is a solution to the problems of rural poverty, which of course have been so high in developing countries. And here, another kind of difference between the rich and the poor countries of the world is to see where are most of the poor living. And here you can see how they're mainly living in the periphery of cities, partly because there's no room in the inner cities. So they can't go there, and they can't even afford to live there, even in the few remaining slums in the inner cities. So the pattern of location with cities actually is quite different, at least from the historic pattern in countries like the United States, where the poor used to go into the inner city, and in many respects still do, and then as they get better off, move to more peripheral areas of the city. So here you find the opposite, and of course the point is the rich people want to live where it's convenient to live, and it's much more convenient to be living close to the urban center, and that was the historic patterns also where the rich came to leave. And the implications are that these people often are really spending hours commuting to jobs. They're not living on the periphery because it's near where the work is, but it's where they can find a place to live. And here really what I wanted to show you is that while in the rich countries there's been a decline in the percentage of people who were living in the informal economy and low-wage work, et cetera. I mean, we have an awful lot of it still today, and possibly it's actually expanding now in the neoliberal era with this class divide that is happening in many of the rich countries. But what you're seeing in the poorer countries is, and this is just taken from Latin America, is how little has changed at the same time as in terms of economic gain. At the same time that the population has become so urban. Just to give you a sense, and this is a classic scene, I'm afraid to say. I first learned about recycling, actually, believe it or not, in Mexico, before it became au courant. It wasn't long before it, but before it became au courant here to recycle anything. I went to I had the honor of going to the garbage dump of Mexico City. And actually, I was blown away by seeing the organization of the garbage dump that's going on there. And it was the turf of people. So the government built this housing outside of the dump because it's so unhealthy, of course, to be living in the dump. And the people who were given those houses turned them over to somebody else, sort of informally and illegally, and went back and lived in the dump. Why? Because that was their livelihood, and they did not want to risk losing it. So it is really very common, and it's a huge network of people who are recycling materials, collecting scrap and things like that. So there is an economy in this work, including involving children. So in conclusion, I just want to say, raise back some of the questions I brought up in the beginning. Is it associated with development? I think, or is it a solution to a problem? Or is it a cause of new problems? And I think what I've really shown you is that it's both. It's a response to problems, but it's also creating a huge network of additional problems. And the last point I want to make is that although we're here to discuss urbanization, but the urban crisis has been a major factor that is contributing to global immigration.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me here, and thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to make a few remarks about a term that Paul used, urban metabolism, and that's a a framework, it's a kind of a lens to look at the city. And we have a project here that's been going for the last couple of years that we call the Metabolism of Boston. And as you can maybe gather from that term, we're looking at cities using the metaphor of an organism. And so we have flows of materials and energy into the city and waste products that are coming out of the city. And that lens allows us to examine how a city works with an eye towards sustainability, ultimately. So in the currency of urban metabolism, or the economy of urban metabolism, we use carbon as kind of the currency. It's the thing that we're tracking because it cuts across the human and the natural systems. So we breathe out carbon dioxide, our tailpipes, our factories, our buildings are emitting carbon dioxide. The trees are taking up carbon dioxide, the soils are processing carbon, the Charles River is delivering carbon to the ocean. And so it really becomes a glue that kind of connects us. And we found some really interesting things in thinking about that metaphor, that lens. As you can gather, it's a very biological metaphor, and yet we are able to see human behavior actually impart itself into that kind of clockwork of the city. And so we're tracking carbon dioxide 24/7 on a roof at Boston University, as well as several other places, including the top of the Prudential building. And we see some really interesting indicators of human behavior on a large scale. For example, in the weekdays versus the weekends, we see a different pattern of carbon dioxide buildup associated with the commute patterns and how those shift between the weekends and the weekdays. And really, when we think about weekends and weekdays, that's a purely human construct in terms of how we partition up our time. It's not tied to any meteorological or any natural phenomenon. And so we really are seeing this behavior of humans writ large. This ties back, this lens. It is limited, and we're trying to think a lot about, well, how do we really get more of the richness of human and social behavior into this? And Enrique and Paul and I and others have really had a conversation about this, and bringing in Jeff West, for example, there's some similarities with how he thinks about it, and how does human behavior get into that idea of scaling that Jeff West has. I'll just share one other little point of connection, since Paul did mention that this Urban Century series is going to culminate with Jeff West coming here and speaking about the science of cities. And it's really interesting that he started off as a nuclear physicist thinking about the large-scale structure of the universe, the kind of dendritic pattern of galaxies and how they form and that kind of thing. And then he shifted from there to thinking about biology. And I was very influenced by the work he did in the mid to latter 90s, where he started looking at everything from elephants to mice to trees, and thinking about biological organisms and how they're able to move materials and energy. And that's where he developed a lot of the kinds of efficiencies of scale, economies of scale, ideas about how trees are able to be very efficient, or why it is that the metabolism of a mouse per unit tissue of a mouse is very much more than that of an elephant. There are some interesting scaling rules that apply, and so now he's asking, well, this leads to how many gas stations you need in a city versus in a smaller community, and the efficiency gains that come from that. So there's really interesting kinds of ways of thinking by people like Jeff West that really kind of match in many ways how we're thinking about cities here in Boston and this concept of urban metabolism going forward. So I'll just leave it at that. And
Thank you.
Well, thank you both, and thank you all for joining us today, and to the Party Center for hosting us. Let me start by saying some things. I'm not an academic. I'm not an urban economist. I'm not an expert on climate change, demographics, a historian, sociologist, or political scientist. But I'm listing all those things because if you're actually going to understand how a city works, they all matter a great deal. and I'm going to try and pull in aspects of all of those topics. What is perhaps relevant to this is my former job. I was the head of economic development strategy for New York City. That's what I did. But I'm not with the city anymore. Nothing I say here should be taken as reflecting anyone's views except my own. When I was doing that work for New York City, one of our conclusions was that global drives local. I think I've heard that theme from both the other speakers this morning. To understand the future for New York City, we first need to understand the global trends shaping that context. By the way, anyone here from Detroit? Detroit? Okay. Sort of, okay. 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 Well, 50 years ago, Detroit's population was 1.8 million, about 60 years ago. Anyone want to hazard a guess what it is today? 600,000. That's about right, 700,000. Now, many factors played into that decline, but the decline of the auto industry was certainly a major factor there. And that was really one of our themes as we started thinking about how you think about economic development for a city. Start to try to understand the global context. And I'll give you a flavor for some of the work we did in New York. New York City is the undisputed business capital of North America. We have about 2.5% of the United States population, between 10 to 20% of the country's professional employment in key categories such as media, fashion, financial services. New York is the headquarters to 50 of the Fortune 500 companies, which is way ahead of any other city in North America.
What was it?
50 out of 500 for the Fortune 500. As we looked at the future, one of the things we saw was a lot of the growth in employment in the U.S. has been in high tech and digital. If you're interested in the numbers since World War II, manufacturing in the United States has been dropping by about 8% a year, manufacturing employment. And little noted fact, actually, New York City's reinvented itself several times. In 1950, 1945, New York was actually one of the major manufacturing hubs of the United States. And again, you get into the question of urban economies of scale, what that means has shifted. In earlier technologies, for a variety of reasons, you wanted the manufacturing right in the city. That changed. By the way, that also is one of the things that hurt Detroit. There used to be some very large auto manufacturing plants that were physically in Detroit. For a number of reasons, technology shifted, those moved out. New York City did pretty well reinventing itself as a business center, as a business hub. As we look to the future, we thought that high tech and digital was a good place to engage, that we had some natural advantages. We already were a media and fashion center. Web 1.0 was about technology somewhat loosely 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago as the internet started kicking off. Getting a website up and running was a key factor of success. As you moved into this age, having business expertise was increasingly a factor of success. So for example, Google's second largest location in the United States is actually in New York City. I don't know if people are familiar with the area around Chelsea Market in Manhattan. Okay. The big building across the street, Google bought that for $1.5 billion. One of the largest buildings actually in Manhattan. So, okay, that seemed like a good place to go. And then what we did was we benchmarked ourselves against other centers that we thought were very successful in this space, San Francisco, Boston. I spent a lot of time understanding those two ecosystems. And one of the things we concluded was that in New York City there was a gap in the market, and that to compete successfully in the 21st century, we needed to up our game in engineering. That, Boston has MIT, San Francisco, or the San Francisco Bay Area has Stanford, and that we really wanted a top tier, an ultra top tier engineering research school. We have NYU and Columbia, they're fine schools, but we felt we could do better. And one of the results of that was the decision to develop what was called Applied Sciences NYC, which has now resulted in Cornell University building a full engineering campus in New York, which is a multi-billion-dollar project to be built out over the next 10 years. So I want to give you a little bit of a feel for how, for one approach anyway, to economic strategy at the urban level, to think about where you are, to try to understand where you think the business context is going, and then to try and think, well, what can we do to expedite that? And an underlying theme here is a city is many different things. You ask, we've heard of it as a biological organism, as from sociology, from the point of view as an economic strategist, what a city is a platform for people to do business. You know, there's a reason people come together. 200 years ago, it was trade. Actually, one of New York's early industries, I believe, was trading beaver pelts, of all the weird things. But there's a reason people come together, and you want to understand those reasons. So with that as kind of as my frame, I thought I'd take a little bit of a look at the world to 2050 and what it means for the urban century. But I actually wanted to start with a favorite comment attributed to that noted philosopher and futurologist Yogi Berra. It's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. So my first prediction actually is expect the unexpected. A good vision plans for the future has to be resilient, flexible enough to absorb shocks. And we've heard some of those themes already this morning. A city requires a large, complex infrastructure, and it's vulnerable to shocks. We saw some of that in the last few weeks with New York City and Sandy. New York City has about 8 million people in 360 square miles. Manhattan has 2 million people in about 20 square miles. There is, just to state the obvious, there is no food produced in New York City. If you want to feed those 8 million people, you need to figure out how to bring into the city each day about 3,000 calories of food per person. You need to bring in water per person, everything. And by the way, just an example of the vulnerability of the system, there's exactly one water pipe into Manhattan. We're now in the process of building a second one. But there is actually only one major water main coming down the spine of Manhattan. The second one will be completed, I think, in about 2 years. So these systems are vulnerable. Quick factoid, New Orleans, 5 years after Katrina was in 2005, 5 years later the population was still down 25%. So what are some things that could go very wrong? And I'm going to talk, and we've all talked about the trend to urbanization, but what are some things that could change all of that? Climate change. If I happen to be one of the people who think climate change is real, it could conceivably result in catastrophic, very sudden climate change. Most cities are based near a major body of water. If they're not based near a major body of water, well, they actually require fresh water to operate. Often that fresh water comes from some type of rain runoff. Again, I'm not going to claim I know exactly which cities in the world are vulnerable, but I will tell you that a city is vulnerable to those sorts of disruptions. Other things, political. I'll talk, and we have all talked, I think, a lot about urbanization in China, which I do think will be the trend. But realize China in the next 40 years is going to have to go through some very major transitions. It's is going to face some interesting internal political transitions. It has a one-child policy. At some point, that has to end. If you look at what could be happening in China, civil war, strife, these are all possibilities. You could see an externally far more aggressive China. There's a wonderful, this is paraphrased from Professor Ferguson at Harvard via Karl Marx. Everyone heard of the expression, religion is the opiate of the masses? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nell's rephrasing of that is, if religion is the opiate of the masses, jingoism and nationalism is the cocaine of a rising middle class or a challenged political elite. It's not that hard to imagine future scenarios where countries such as China, India, Nigeria, Brazil, Pakistan, or any other list of countries is facing internal problems because of urbanization, stresses, political transitions, and chooses to deal with those problems by taking an aggressive foreign policy. And that could have a lot of issues. US policy in the 1950s was actually to try and somewhat tilt people away from urban centers. We were worried about nuclear war. Whether that happens again, whether governments start thinking about that, interesting issue. Post 9/11, and this was a tension for the city, the federal government wanted redundant backup facilities in certain banking and service areas, and it wanted those facilities at least 50 miles away from New York City. On one level, I fully understand why the government wanted that. If you're New York City, telling our major employers to move things away from New York City, not what you want to hear. So with those caveats, I still think we're going to see the continued triumph of the cities. I just wanted to flag there may be some bumps on the road. This was already touched on today. Africa and Asia are predominantly rural. The numbers I had were around 40% for those two areas living in urban settlements. By 2050, the UN was estimating 65%. What I'm not here to argue it's good or bad, but what I will say is you're going to be seeing several hundred million people moving into megacities, cities that frankly don't have the correct infrastructure for the people they already have. There is going to be a huge need to build housing, sewer, schools, and transports. Actually, though, if you look at it, we're the mirror image of that. Most of our infrastructure and transport, or most of our infrastructure, was built late 19th century, early 20th century. The developing world is now going through what we did in the late 19th century. And by the way, the growth rates for New York City, Boston, et cetera, were really actually quite staggering at the end of the 19th century. I alluded to that water tunnel. It was put in the late 19th century. It's made of wood. It's drilled through rock and a wood frame. New York City is having to go through those renovation projects. I actually think the Boston T is a lovely system, but parts of it are pretty antiquated. So if you're in China, you're looking at having to go build a transit system from scratch. If you're in the United States, you're looking at the transit system you built 100 years ago and saying, yeah, I guess this needs to be replaced. Different problems, but still problems. But there are some advantages to being in the developing world. Has anyone here, New Delhi recently opened a new airport within about the last 3 years or so. Anyone seen that, had been in that airport? It's a stunning airport, trust me. I've been there. I actually flew from there to Newark. Newark looks pathetic compared to this airport. It is not what you would think of as being the airport of a third world country. It is the airport of a 21st century country. There are some real advantages to building things from scratch. I mean, they had a very old, antiquated airport. It was busting at the seams. Society agreed we have to go build something, and they built something, and they could build it from scratch. But with all the stresses, all the issues around urban poverty, I do think we're going to continue to see a trend towards urbanization. Hypothesis, rising prosperity leads to demand for services that really come best in a city. Intellectual, cultural, education, medical. Mechanically, they're often best provided in a city due to the need for a large catchment area. A wonderful museum like the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, it needs to be centered in an area that has a few million people around it to come in. And for people, as they get more affluent who want those types of activities, they're going to want to be in cities. As the developing world does the shift from industry to service, and I believe they're going to, services tend to be urban. Climate change, leading to carbon taxes and conservation, generally speaking, favors cities. Cities are simply a lot more energy efficient. And how do I put it? On the one hand, a large city, as I noted, is vulnerable to climate change, but it's also easier to protect. It costs, again, I use the example of New York City. On the one hand, you do have 2 million people living in 20-odd square miles. On the other hand, the entire circumference of Manhattan is about 24 square miles. It's actually not that expensive to go raise the water bumpers by about a foot. If you have to do that all along the eastern seaboard of the United States, it's a lot more expensive. So in some ways, cities are easier to protect. Topic of megacities has already been touched on. The US, I think we're going to be seeing much more focus outwards. We're going to be shrinking as a share of the global economy. As we look at our cities, New York, 1/2 of the workforce of New York City was born outside of the US. We are going through an immigration boom in this country, which is actually in some ways comparable to what happened in the 19th century. For a lot of reasons, cities tend to attract immigrants far more so than rural areas. So the trends we're seeing at the country level are going to disproportionately happen at the urban level. In terms of maybe some other broader predictions, thinking about the world as a whole, and again, some of these we've already touched on, so I'll go through them quite quickly. By 2050, global population is expected to be 9 billion, up from 7 billion today. China, India, and the USA will be the world's largest economies. for the first time in 100 years, the United States will be, at best, the world's second largest economy. And that actually matters a lot, because for most of the last 100 years, if you were an American industry or sector, if you were the leader in the US, you were almost by definition a global leader, because you were in the biggest market. So we had the economies of scale. And just to give you an interesting factoid, in 2011, auto production in China was 18 million units, 18 million cars, trucks. In the US, it was 8.7 million. In the auto industry, we're already just a regional market. And by the way, 30 years ago, there was almost no auto production in China. And let's take that another step. When the US is no longer the center of the economic world, what will it be like for cities? Will they feel less global? And let's, let's look a little bit at Boston. Apologies. One of the major sectors in Boston is the great educational institutions. Boston University, Harvard, MIT, Northeastern. BU, Harvard, and MIT all aspire to be global institutions. A significant portion of their student body is foreign. A significant portion of the faculty is foreign. Well, they all want to be here because, you know, the US is where you want to be. Right now, of the world's top 10 universities by rankings, of the world's top 10 universities, 10 of them are American. Well, if the US is the world's second largest economy, and a lot of the growth and excitement's happening in Asia, I'm going to make a bet that there'll be some Chinese universities and Indian universities in that top 10 list, and that we're going to move down. So what does that start meaning for a city like Boston? Swinging back, really just some quick factoids on the US, and this goes to the demographic transition we're going to be going through. US population is going to go from about 300 million to 435 million by 2050. About 80% of that increase is coming from immigrants or their US-born descendants. By 2050, about 1 in 5 Americans will be an immigrant. That compares to about 1 in 8 today. And that will surpass the peak we reached actually in the 19th century immigration boom. The Latino population, which is already our largest minority group, will triple in size and be about 30% of the US population. The US elderly population will double in size by 2050. Dependency ratio, the number of children and elderly per working population, goes from 60 per 100 to 72 per 100. And I'm mentioning this because if I had to offer a hypothesis about cities, they're going to be at the forefronts of these trends. As I said, immigrants, at least in our experience, have tended to like urban areas. So it's going to be even more distinctly, the cities have large concentrations of immigrants. At least some hypothesis that elderly will find it easier to operate in a city, that it has access to the sorts of cultural institutions, et cetera, that people in that age group want to be dealing with. So you can see the cities are going to be reshaped in that way. Last point about the US, and this may be true in other countries, but it's certainly a US point. I think there's going to be an increasing sort of structural tension between the cities and the more rural areas. If you look at the economics of the United States, a lot of the economic value add is in the urban areas. It basically subsidizes much of the rest of the country. At the same time, because of some of the ways the voting works, voting blocks work, et cetera, it's not always clear that there is the same level of political support. The myth of the family farmer has a lot of appeal, the myth of the rural homestead. And I think you're going to see a lot of tension because there's going to be a need for a huge amount of money to retrofit the urban areas. And it's not clear how willing the rest of the country is going to be to make the adjustments that are necessary. So those are my thoughts. Thank you.
Sure. Well, thank you all. At this point in time, I open up for questions, and I'll look for enthusiastic and engaged audience members to speak up.
We need to use the mics.
Nothing burning at top of mind. One of the things that I want to go off and really pursue is, particularly Stephen, in your last comments and your comments, Susan, initially, is looking at the center, as the city becoming a dominant center in the landscape, politically, economically, culturally, et cetera. Does that, and Enrique and I have had these conversations before, I'm very pro-city-state in terms of the evolution of governance and development and so forth. And does that portend the rise of the city-state as the dominant entity as opposed to the state itself?
I can only really comment on the U.S. And one of the tensions for the U.S. is our, how do I put it, our boundaries, our political boundaries have nothing to do with our economic realities. So if you think about New York City, which is the area that I'm most familiar with, the New York metro region actually has about 20 million people in it. And it spills over into New Jersey, Connecticut, and Long Island. All sorts of different political structures. I mean, it's not even like there are just 3 other people at the table, because, you know, Connecticut itself, we actually spill over into several different municipalities. So, and this alludes to that problem I'd mentioned earlier, that for the U.S. to manage those sort of big regional projects is actually proving very complicated. Looking out on the world, and I actually should just turn to other folks, I think places like Singapore, which is really sort of the classic example of the city-state.
Poster child of development, yeah.
Have demonstrated that that kind of a city-state model has a lot of flexibility, a lot of ability to plan and do things well. Arguably, Dubai has tried to follow that sort of model, but sorry, those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Susan, any additional thoughts on that?
I think to the extent that the dominant classes live in cities, that definitely disproportionate power is located there. But on this newest wave of democratization in developing countries, the so-called third wave of democracy, that there has really been a expansion of the franchise to the population at large, which has given rural populations much more import than they had had in the past. So you have countries such as Bolivia right now that have an indigenous, so-called indigenous president, which would have been unheard of, until the turn of the century, when they had very little political power. So in some sense, I think there is some redistribution of power. It's not easy because the elite still have a lot of informal power. But I wouldn't say there's just a mechanistic kind of shift of power to the cities in this new age, with political power becoming more dispersed.
And with these enormous waves of migration moving to the urban centers, whether it's the center where the elites are living, or the peri-urban centers where the service...
Right, so you could say actually the political power with migration is shifting it to the city, but it's in part shifting away from the dominant classes and bringing rise to new kinds of tensions between who has the economic power and who has the political power, and kind of in a way that is really without precedent globally.
And from there's the push-pull, as you say. Part of the inclusion is enumeration, title of the land, and so forth, and developments or evolution of those sorts of policies at the city level. What do you see happening in terms of your area of research around progressive policies and programs related to that?
Well, first of all, I want to go back a step, and I don't think Singapore is a model for the developing world. I mean, it's good in what it does, but it really is a city-state. It's in terms of its population, and the economy is very atypical for the world. You can't have many Singapores in this world, it's a sort of center of international finance. So you could argue it's very good what they've done, and it is on an urban base, but it's really, I don't see it as serving as an example for other countries. So I wanted to say that. So then your question is what kind of strategies are being done?
Policies in terms of inclusion and citizen engagement.
One of the new trends is sort of more citizen participation. Brazil kind of led that, and it was an urban, it wasn't a primate city in Brazil, but in Porto Alegre, I'm sorry, I was blanking on the name, became really a model for citizen participation, democratic involvement in decision making. And that became a model in Brazil and has been picked up in many other countries. So there are some very interesting models out there that are developing that are new and that are more responsive to the concerns of ordinary people. Which doesn't mean they don't have their own sets of problems, but that they do reflect an effort to decentralize political power. And so you could say that's to secondary cities, to new social classes, historically. So.
And coming full circle a little bit of it as well, as if we're looking to go off and build cities of the future without precedent or without a model for that, how are we in fact going to make informed decision? How are we going to go off and develop those programs? We talk about evidence-based policy making here in the city of Boston an awful lot, and part of that is scientific evidence, part of it is social science evidence. What's the mechanism by which we go off and start to explore new ways or better ways of doing things as opposed to fighting the last war on a different landscape with different tools?
We have one question for the audience, but apologies, one comment I did just one bit. And this goes to both of your remarks. And I've only been to Singapore once, and I've spoken with a few of their officials. What I admire about Singapore is not so much what the choices they made, but at the civil service level, the process by which they made those choices. So it was interesting. I heard a discussion with one of their folks on congestion pricing. And it was a very thoughtful process. It was evidence-based. They tried things that didn't work. They tried something else, and they were able to plan at sort of a regional level to get that done. And I have nothing against New Jersey, Connecticut, or Long Island, but it's simply much more complicated for New York because with the best will in the world, it's just a lot of different people in the room. But anyway.
We did try it in New York, and it didn't pass.
Yes. I mean, we
let's take the question.
What I find very interesting about the presentations so far, which are excellent summaries of your fields, is just what's missing. And what's missing is alongside or integrated and juxtaposed with the sociological analyses and the ecological analyses and your management concerns is the whole question of the immigration into cities. How are these people going to be socialized? How are they going to be enculturated? How are they going to find their way? And as we look historically, long term, what we see is that historically people became integrated through cultural, political, religious, civil society organizations. That's how it worked. And these people, and then these organizations, and particularly the religious organizations in Latin America and the U.S., were major, major forces for socialization, for connecting people politically, for getting them jobs. And anthropologists see this going on across the developing world. I mean, we not only can look at Latin America historically to see what role the church had and then the reaction against the church had, but if you look across the world and you look at these smaller scale studies of people entering cities, they're being socialized into religious community networks, and this is how they're coming in. And this is how they're finding their way. This is how they're finding their sources of social support. This is how they're finding jobs. And I think that this aspect of these cultural, political, religious organizations is something we don't have good evidence on. It's not as if you're looking at housing or carbon flows, but we don't have very good evidence on these kinds of formal or informal political networks. And particularly, I think the religious dimension is going to be very, very important in terms of socialization, in terms of the ways in which cities develop either more or less pluralistically. We see this going on throughout the Middle East right now, and I simply want to sort of shift our perspective, at least momentarily, to look at it from the bottom up rather than from the top down, you know, because there's always this management perspective that says, and how are we going to develop, you know, the studies? And what I always ask in that circumstance is, okay, who are we? Mm-hmm. You know, I have an idea of who your we is, but I'd like us to look at everyone else.
Well, your point is very well taken, and you know, my comments to that specifically also relate to my listening as well. Is in the developed world, what I was hearing through the discussion was cultural centers are attracting people, economies are attracting people, jobs are attracting people. In other markets where there is that center does not exist, what will emerge out of that migration? What will emerge as cultural identity? What will emerge as an economy as a result of the migration of those folks? And through what process does that all happen? That's a question that I don't understand myself as power moves south and east. Those are very big questions. Comment in the back.
As we think about the next 40 or 50 years, I'm always wary about using the previous 40 or 50 years as a predictor for what's coming forward, since so much of what built the megacity was pre-internet. And I'm wondering, are there some countervailing factors as we think about the future city and the future role of the city into thinking that maybe there'll be depopulation of sorts? Maybe we'll be able to work in ways in which we don't have to co-locate. Maybe Boston University will be much more of a virtual entity in which we could have professors all over the world teaching students all over the world, in which case cities become irrelevant or less relevant. How do we balance the notion that we can have a dispersed population with this greater value that is being placed on bumping up against each other in very densely populated areas?
I think that's a really excellent question. I'm from a former geography department, and there's the term the death of geography based on the rise of the internet and how really distance doesn't matter as much anymore. Tom Friedman's book also alludes to that, and I think that's a really good question. I don't have a great answer to that question, but definitely ability to be remote and interacting is going to have some kind of impact on our physical co-location.
Actually, kind of along those same lines, one of my discoveries last year, I teach a global health course here, and was that there are more people in the world with a cell phone than with a toilet. And it kind of is an interesting, and a lot of those people without a toilet live in urban areas. In Kampala, for example, they have what they call the flying toilet, which is a plastic bag which flies after you're done with it. And it seems as though we're kind of people forging ahead with the communications in their private sphere. They're able to purchase a cell phone for a reasonable price and maintain it. Even very poor people have access now to cell phones. But that sort of that infrastructure that's more complicated, more of an upfront investment, and perhaps perceived as, there are alternatives to constructing a latrine or having a toilet. And so the physical implications of that for a dense population are pretty important from a public health point of view. And when you were talking about the flows and metabolism, I was waiting for you to get to that other flow of sewage, water in and sewage and so on, because that's also an issue which it also goes to our aging infrastructure. And I'm really shocked and horrified, really, to hear that New York City is served by one wooden tunnel. Because
so is Boston, by the way. Mm-hmm. And it failed on May 1st, 2010, and 2.2 million people were without water because of that
I was one of
failure.
them.
Yes.
I remember. I didn't realize it was because we had a single wooden tunnel.
It's not wooden, but it's a single pipe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And
so I'm starting to ramble, but I just put out there that the infrastructure to cope with the density of human population also needs attention.
Hi. So far, all of the talk is about the largest megacities, and while I recognize that a lot of urbanites across the earth certainly live in these places, it's not where all urban people live. So that said, what do you see the role of kind of the smaller cities in the United States? I'm thinking, Springfield, Massachusetts, Gary, Indiana, what have you. What role, how can these places sort of reinvent themselves, or do they reinvent themselves as we move along? And in the developing world, cities of 50,000 all the way up until, much smaller than these, the largest cities that we've been speaking about so far, what role do they play in this process?
Well, getting back to the death of geography, there, in some respects, are regional benefits to being in certain locations. So with agriculture or certain crops or products that are regionally located, I think that's one reason that cities can persist and grow in the areas that they're in. So I would see that as a positive development, and we see that local economies, there's resurgence if you think about New England and apple growing, for example, and the value-added aspects of apples, that's a positive thing, and it can invigorate small towns and regional cities, and I think that's a positive direction that we can focus on.
I think, to add my own perspective, I'm not trying to take things over as moderator here, but I would argue that while there's a tendency in historical precedent of the megacity development, I think at some point in time that method of development will, by its out of its own just sense of scale or weight of scale, will slow down over time, and the rise of the middle-sized cities, particularly here in the United States, you see the growth rates of cities in middle-sized, you see the fastest economic development, year over year in the last several years in the middle-level cities. And I think from a standpoint of development and policy, one might think of looking to broaden your policy development to look more at that middle tier of cities as an opportunity to go off and create the benefit of cities, density and urbanization, with the ability to go off and manage scale and build it in a reasonably sustainable way such that you can build resilience into those cities so that they will benefit and protect from social, economic, and the environmental shocks which are bound to happen to them. So it's a question of smart policy and specifically targeted prescriptive policy. The question is that the right policy in my mind? And without evidence to the contrary, I'm not sure that we know the answer to that. Yeah, so maybe that's an area of research.
Yes to all that. I just sort of maybe add or reposition slightly. In my mind, nothing I've said, or at least nothing I meant to say, implies everyone in the United States is going to end up in New York City. When you look at cities, and New York is obviously one I'm most familiar with, there are trade-offs and there are equilibriums. New York, because of those cultural, other attractions, is considered one of the best places, one of the best urban places in the United States to live. But for that reason, it is also the most expensive city in the United States. Twice the national average, about 30% more expensive than Boston. So one place where you immediately start seeing trade-offs are simply that there are people who have different preference functions. They don't want to live in a one-bedroom apartment. Granted that one-bedroom apartment may be next to Central Park, but they'd rather have a house in Minneapolis. So I think there will be a tendency just for the price system to move people apart. Yes, there are some pressures that bring things together, but there are also pressures that push them apart. I alluded to earlier, in any organization, there's a desire not to put everything in one basket. There are, even without the federal government saying it, any good risk manager, risk recovery expert will tell you, no, we're not putting everyone in corporate headquarters. There are a lot of reasons you want to separate them. It was also alluded to different parts of the country simply have different specializations. The U.S. remains a major agricultural powerhouse. Iowa, Des Moines, Minneapolis, et cetera, all have expertises in those areas which A, need to be in the farm area, and B, it's not like anybody else in the country is probably able to recreate that. So again, I don't know particularly the cities in Massachusetts. My suspicion is there are logical reasons why many of them will continue and may even grow faster than Boston or New York.
Mm-hmm. I think part of the challenge I would add also is really looking at the operational challenges that cities face today, working across their various departments and services areas. Generally, we think of the academic institutions reasonably siloed and isolated department from department. That's very true in the city. And as we look at these challenges, you can see the social side, the economic side, the governance side, et cetera. These are interdisciplinary problems which require groups to come together and, in fact, through new mechanisms, address the challenge and the question, establish policy, enact that policy, and figuring out how one goes about doing that as an organizational process is a very significant challenge, but very fundamental to moving forward, whether you're in a large city or not. We see that in our work here in the city of Boston, where just our participation as academics, whether it's us alone or working with Harvard or MIT or others, the ability to convene people across different departments of the city to actually have that discussion of when I wiggle this bad thing happens to you, and get an appreciation for that is the fundamental starting point of developing language in that dialogue and understanding. Yeah.
So my question is actually about going down into cities and kind of drilling to the neighborhood level, right? If you think about, especially urban sociology that's looked at American cities, Western European cities, a city is more than just a unitary thing, right? It's more than just a single shape on a map. It has 10s, 20s, 30s of little areas that have their own characteristics that are, socially and institutionally encoded. They're there, and the people who live there have a certain impression of it. The impression of it from outside kind of shapes public dialogue. We can think about here in Boston, the Mattapan massacre. You hear the term Mattapan. That means something to people, and so then there's this heterogeneity in the city that's very meaningful to the people who live in those regions and people who live around them. And I have two questions based on the different expertises that were in the panel. One is, how are neighborhoods emerging, and what is the perception of neighborhoods in developing countries? Is it similar to the way we see it in our sort of 19th century growing eastern seaboard cities, or is there a different aspect to it? Another one is with the metaphor of the organism, city as organism, how do neighborhoods function? Are they cells? And then do we have to start thinking about, the metaphor a little bit more specifically in terms of what do the different cells contribute to the organism, and thinking about it that way, as opposed to a single like amoeba or bacterium? And then how does neighborhood articulate that metaphor further?
Yeah, I'll start with your last question. I think that the neighborhood is the first scale above the individual household in which community is defined. And so it's crucial. It's absolutely crucial. What I think in our work with the Sustainable Neighborhood Lab, which is why that name was there, was because we recognized how important that scale is. That what I really feel is lacking is a connection between the community at the scale of the neighborhood and the resources that sustain those neighborhoods. For example, people don't know where their water pipes are. They don't know where their electricity is coming from. They don't know where their natural gas is coming from. We are so detached from the systems that sustain us, which are the systems of, with the biological metaphor, they're the tubes and veins and pipes and, things that are sustaining our homes and our neighborhoods. And so there's a big detachment there that I think needs to be addressed.
Yes, there are so many things that I could have commented as we went along. So I'll just make a few somewhat disconnected comments. But one thing I want to say is that when we talk about immigration to countries like the United States or Western Europe, we are talking about people coming from developing countries. 75% of our immigrants now come from developing countries. So even though we've had large-scale immigration a century ago, the place of origin is very different. And that's reflecting, what's going on in developing countries, that the opportunities simply, for many people, are not there, whether you're highly skilled or whether you're low skilled. So as opportunities are dividing globally, this is a factor that's contributing to migration. So I just really want to say that when we're talking about the United States and these kinds of issues, it's connected to some of the issues that I've been alluding to. And this woman who left, I guess I don't have to really address her issue, but one of the things that's happening with the new immigration are transnational ties. I actually thought that's where her question was going, but it didn't go there. And so these are kinds of linkages now that are occurring across borders, and through money that immigrants are sending back home, they are helping to improve conditions in their home countries. And this is people to people, community to community. And so these are just very, very interesting developments. Now, there's a few places. The question is, how much is that really fueling development back home? And the evidence is really very uneven. It's been different. Morocco is one of the countries where the government's been very, very effective in getting the migrants to Europe to channel their remittances through, which is the money that people are sending home, through state banks. And so it's been able to leverage remittances, not just for the recipients on the individual level or family level, but also to leverage the money through the bank for development purposes. So the reason we have migration and the reason we have immigration is because things aren't working in the places of origin. And so then the issue is that there are some institutional and people-to-people kinds of mechanisms that have evolved to try to deal with those issues. Now, on the specific thing of neighborhoods, I think it really depends. I think well, there are two things. You have the Porto Alegre example that I gave you, which is really an effort to at the, I don't know if I'd say just at the neighborhood level, but at the city level, to try to be more participatory and respond to local demands. In many countries in the developing world, resources are highly centralized. And so that at the local level, people don't really have that much resources to work with to do things. And so it makes it very hard for community to have much meaning. And then you also have politicians who try to centralize the power for their own purposes, and they don't want a lot of decentralized politics because it undermines their own power bases. So it's a complicated issue, and I think there are various kinds of scenarios. And my own work was on squatter settlements, is that really was informal community at its most vibrant point, where people who squatted on land got together to put pressure on the government to legalize their claims to land, to build schools for their children, roads, markets, etc. But the end product of the negotiation in which they get all those goods and services actually has been to diffuse local power. So I think the evidence is very mixed, but I don't see a big, vibrant neighborhood kind of dynamics in most developing countries.
Steve, New York is a city of neighborhoods, is that right?
Yes, although I was going to allude to something else, and actually I'll just offer this for anybody who's a graduate student or student looking for a research topic. I would argue that in many of the major urban centers in a developed country, community is not physically based. That
it can be transnational too.
It can be transnational, or for example, I lived for a number of years in London. One of my friends there was Italian. He was very much plugged into the Italian community of London. You know, he had even people who necessarily weren't from his part of Italy. Nonetheless, that was his social group. In New York City, it might be a religious group. It might be, you know, a health club. It may be any number of different things. How do I phrase this? I mean, it just wasn't as physical. I mean, if you ask, actually an interesting question. I actually am not that familiar with Boston or Massachusetts system of government, but do people know who is their local representative to the state legislature? Anyone can name, for those of you who live here in Boston, anyone able to name it?
K-Con.
I'm sorry?
K-Con.
Okay, we've got one person. Anyone else can name? Okay, two people? Three. This is better than I've thought, actually. But I'm looking at seeing a number of other blank faces. People just aren't, they expect their city services to work, they expect their state services to work in a developed country. And it's not, trust me, your state representative wants to hear from you. I mean, as somebody who dealt with politicians, most of them actually like to meet their constituents. Their constituents don't want to meet them, they just want things to work. Sorry.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you. I have a question that is related to a question that came from behind us about using models from, say, the past to think about today or the future. But I was thinking more using models from, you know, say, the US to think about other places. Now, you know, my interest is in African cities, you know, and you, Professor Susan Eckstein, used a slide, some of the slides about sort of defining some of the areas in the city. And, you know, one of the slides was slums. And I basically wanted to see some definitional aspects of urban areas. You know, if we use the U.S. cities, we think about the proper neighborhood is maybe a planned neighborhood versus an unplanned area in neighborhood or a slum in an African country such as Kampala. Given that many people are moving to these areas, never going to see a planned neighborhood, is using slum to demarcate them. You know, what are the policies from your experience in Latin America or from other places? What are the government policies towards these areas? Are they trying to plan them? Is that why they call them slums?
I mean, I think there are some efforts. Then there's the tension. If you put too much into the planning, it'll attract more people to the city. So It's kind of a catch-22, but there have been some, even the World Bank has tried to deal with projects that make for a more rational development of cities and neighborhoods, such as their sites and services programs, which are low-cost efforts where poor people, in a sense, can acquire land at low cost and supplies at low cost, and often build their own housing, even if it's by some plan. You know, I think there are big arguments within urban development about this, because sort of the what's her name, Jane Jacobs kind of approach about cities are much better when they're spontaneous, and people can, when people build their own housing, they can alter the houses as they become wealthier or as their family expands, and so there's a flexibility to make the city work better for these people than these more organized efforts that have their own logic and positive aspects too, because you can plan the roads and things like that, so that then it's much better. But I think each of these kinds of approaches has their own sets of positive and negative aspects to them. I mean, I know the urban neighborhoods that I studied, I can't recognize them anymore if I go there. They've you know, changed so much physically that, you know, I keep asking the cab driver, are you sure you brought me to the right place? So anyway, I mean, it is an issue. I think that one has to try to plan, but one has to realize also the limits of planning, and that when they are out of sync with what people's own interests are, you're going to find an informal city or informal economies developing with them. So it's a delicate balance between formal plans and societal wants and needs. So.
I think unfortunately we're out of time, and we probably have other things that are in our calendars for this afternoon. We need to be moving along. I'd love to just continue the conversation all day. This is a broad and comprehensive and massive topic with fuzzy boundaries and overlaps. We've attempted to start a dialogue about the issues of urban development and urbanization in the urban century. It's the beginning of a conversation, hopefully not the end. Party looks to play a role to bring as many of you into that discussion as possible. So you will have further thoughts and ideas after you've left the room today, and over Christmas break and into next semester. Please reach out to any one of us to try and engage, because certainly Boston University and our partners, Harvard, and the other schools around the city are really looking to engage on this as a very important, significant issue of research, implementation, and action. And we need as much help in terms of guiding that as possible, but also participating in moving the program forward. So thank you for coming, and we look to hear from you again.